Yeah. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me today. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes, we hear you well.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. It's a great delight to be at the conference and to be able to be at the start of the conference. I apologise for speaking in English. I hope you can follow what I say. Today I'd like to introduce a talk called Data Use by Small-Scale Horticultural Producers in Wales. Wales is one of the countries of the United Kingdom, the UK. The UK is made up of 4 countries: England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So Wales is one of those countries and has a Prince of Wales. So I'd like to talk to you about directions for the provision of digital information in rural management. Can we go to the next slide, please? So today I'd like to talk to you about food system resilience, then what affects food systems. I'd like to give you a case study of Wales. Wales is interesting because it has traditions with horticulture dating back several thousand years, and it's developed an industry which is mainly micro businesses, so very small scale businesses. But they're very important to food security and to the food supply resilience. Then I'd like to talk to you a little bit about precision agriculture, and then finish by mentioning good practice in developing digital applications, which is what your organisation and conference is all about. Next slide, please. This is food security measurements. These are the measurements used by the Food and Agriculture Organisation and were first put forward in 2008. And these are the measurements which are looked at to make sure that a country or a village has food security. So these measurements are mortality, malnutrition, whether anybody is suffering from malnutrition, how diverse the diet is. So whether you're getting good food and a balanced diet. It's also important that there's access to water, that you have livelihood assets, so there is a good standard of living, and if there are changes, then there is resilience to those changes within the community. Slide number 3, please. So I'd like to begin by giving you some definitions of food system dynamics. First is resistance. And this is an old definition which was used in ecology. Resistance is the ability of a system to remain unchanged when challenged by disturbances. So if there are problems in the food supply chain, then there aren't any changes within it if the system is resistant. So that's the definition of resistance. Slide number 5, please. This is the definition of resilience. So resilience is the capacity of a system to absorb disturbances and reorganize so that it returns to the same function. So if you get a disturbance in the system, so if one crop fails in one year, you do get disturbance, the food system is affected, but if you have mechanisms to adjust to that disturbance, you can return to the same system that you had before. So food system resilience is a very important thing to develop. So food resistance and food resilience have been used in a lot of publications recently in relation to something called tipping point. Tipping point is something that you reach when resilience is exceeded, and then the system can't return to its original system. So we look very closely at when we're approaching that tipping point. We want to stay in food system resilience rather than change the system so that damages occur. So those are the definitions of food system dynamics. I'd like to have those in mind as we talk about the other aspects of the food systems. Slide number 6, please. Now I call this slide the cycle of influence. These relate to the small-scale farmer. So these are the factors that act upon the small-scale farmer. So what's called the small-scale farmer, the producer. That farmer might also process some of the food. It might change it in some way, package it, or they might process it into another product. So those groups are the producer and the processor. Now they're acted upon by the growing environment. So that's the environment in which they grow the crops. They have an interaction with the retailer, the person who sells the crops. There's also an influence from the consumer, the person who eats the crops, and the government also has an effect on what happens with each of those within the cycle of influence. So there we have a number of actors within the cycle for the growers, and we have to bear each of those in mind when we look at formulating policy for the use of digital equipment. Slide number 7, please. I'd like to just go into a little more detail in each of those actors within the cycle of influence. Firstly, we have the growing environment, and we can divide that into 2 parts. The biotic part, which is the living environment. So these things are biodiversity, the pests and diseases, and the risks to plant health, which are very important for our resilience mechanisms, and the pollinators. In Europe, we're having a big problem in maintaining the populations of bees because farmers have started using a product called a neonicotinoid, and it's affected our bee populations very severely, putting our crops at risk of non-pollination. So those are the living factors. We also have the abiotic, or non-living factors, such as water quality, the climate, and how stable that climate is, the fertilizers we use, and other chemicals like pesticides, the condition of the soils, and the pollutants. So all of these are very important when we think about food policy, and also the information that the farmer might require. Slide number 8, please. So these are the factors that affect the processor. So the producer needs knowledge, needs technical skills, but needs to access information and share knowledge. And this is very important to the digital economy, and I'll come on to this a little later on. The producer also has to know the product and maybe develop the product. So that's the knowledge the farmer has to have. But also it has to be involved with the markets. So the competition has to be awareness of the competition, but has to be able to access the markets and also be able to operate within fair contracts. So that's the markets. There is also an influence of the economics. So how much can the producer grow? What's the land tenure? Does the farmer own the land? Or is the farmer at risk of losing the land? The cost of transport. How far does the farmer have to transport goods? Are energy costs or the availability of energy a problem to the farmer? Finance is very important to the farmer. Does the farmer have enough money to be able to purchase the seeds and grow the crops purchase the equipment, or will the farmer have access to loans and credit? Taxation can also be a large influence on the profitability of the farmer and the livelihoods. So the producer is influenced by the government, whether the government gives financial support or whether it gives support through regulations and laws that it has. And also the small-scale farmer has to be very aware of the social aspects, the family structures, so the ages and the employment and the livelihoods for his or her family. And I've also mentioned here producer organisations. These are becoming increasingly important. So when farmers get together and are able to lobby or be advocates for improvement in farming, or be able to market their products together, or to be able to organise finance, or to have information provided to them. So this is a very important development that we will need to think about. Slide number 9, please. So these are the influences on the retailer, and you can see a lot of these are very similar to those that I mentioned for the producers and processors. So we've got the markets, again, the sourcing, where does the retailer buy from? How does the retailer find the farmers? How stable is that supply for the retailer to be able to sell the crops in the shops? How do they write contracts and how do they maintain them? What prices are they going to set and what profits are they going to make? And they're influenced by local conditions and global conditions as well. Also, there's going to be competition between retailers, and there are market trends, and we have these very much through the influence of television and advertising, that certain crops become very popular at certain times and then less popular at others. The retailer also has to have knowledge, just as the producer does, so needs to know how to control waste so that not too much of the product's lost, and that might relate to the shelf life, how long the product can stay within the shops. In the large retail chains, supermarkets, there is a lot of research and work on transport, on what are called logistics, so how the products are moved around to produce the lowest costs of transport. And there's also the marketing aspect of how you position your product in the shop to promote it and sell it, and how you might get the producer to develop that product so it's more fitted for sale. Then we have the social aspects, which are looking at the trends within the markets, but also how the retailer has labour within the shops and how that's provided and trained. And just like the producer, the retailer has to have access to finance and is influenced by taxation. Slide number 10, please. Now these are the influences on the consumer. So these are related to those FAO criteria, the measurements that were set out. So there's access of the consumer to the product, whether it's going to be available. So this relates to the production, but also relates to whether the markets, the trade, remains functioning. And a functioning trade is very important to continued supply. The consumer also has to have affordable crops. It's no use if those crops are just there, but the consumer can't buy them. There needs to be a stability of supply, but the consumer is also influenced by the marketing from the retailer and other advertising. And the consumer also needs education or the passing on of skills to provide choice and a balanced diet to the family. Slide number 11, please. This is government policy. So the producer organisations can influence this. This is done by lobbying. But the government policy that influences each of those other players are financial, so the support systems or the intervention systems where money might be supplied, the taxation, and the import and export regulations and the tariffs. Now Wales is particularly being subject to these because we've had a decision by people to leave Europe, and it's causing a lot of changes and a complete alteration of our farming system and the way government policy works. So very big changes in regulations and tariffs that we're going through at the moment. So there are a number of different regulations that affect the farmer. We might have plant varieties that the government requires the farmer to grow, and there may be even patents on those crops. The regulations to do with packaging and with waste disposal. I'm particularly involved in plant health and the transport of crops across borders to guard against pests and diseases being exported and imported into countries. We also have very strict regulations on pesticides, what can be used, and fertilizers that can be used and how they affect the land around us. We also have regulations on planning and land use, and this is related to buildings, but also to land tenure. There are health and safety regulations which relate to the safety of the farmers themselves, but also the safety of the crops that are produced. Workers on the land are protected by employment law, but so are the employers. And we have a lot of food safety regulations. So all those are designed to protect the various players in that cycle of influence that I showed you. Slide number 12, please. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about a case study. Now Horticulture Wales was an organisation that I ran on behalf of the government. We delivered services through social media and training and mentoring to about 800 businesses across Wales. And in 2015, we surveyed 74 of the horticultural producers in Wales. And we used the data from those collections to describe business characteristics. So I'll just show you some of the data that we found from Wales, and it might be interesting for you to compare these data with your own countries. So, slide number 13, please. This is a graph of the crops. So the percentage of the growers that we surveyed that grew certain crops. So you can see that we have a lot of potatoes grown, 20% of growers grew those. 26% grew root vegetables like carrots. 20% grew top fruit like apples. 32% grew other types of vegetables like cabbage. 35%, the highest number, grow soft fruit, things like strawberries. 24% grow salad crops. For instance, lettuce is very important for us, and tomatoes. 30% grow ornamental crops. Now these are plants that are grown for gardeners to buy and put in their ornamental gardens. So this is a very important part of the trade. 18% grow herbs, which are used in cooking, things like thyme. And 9% grow other crops. So these might be things like cut flowers or cut leaves for ornamental decorations. Now, that's an overview of the type of crops that are grown, but it's interesting to see that each of those businesses gave a typical work structure of only 2 full-time employees. So you can see that our structure in Wales is very much small-scale growers, very small numbers of employees, just 2. Slide number 14, please. So this is a map of the growers in Wales, showing different types of growers, whether they are ornamentals, which are pink stars, edible crops, which are green, or others which are blue. And you can see that most of our growers are around big cities in the south of Wales, or around the tourist resorts in the southwest, or the northwest, the islands there, or around the big cities and the borders with England. But you can see very little growing goes on in the centre of the country, which is a mountainous region. Slide number 15, please. So here's a pie chart of the percentage of respondents to the survey by their age. And this is very interesting. Only 1% of people who work in the horticulture industry are in their 20s. 50%, 44% are in their 50s. But 31% are over 60 years of age. And this is very important because we mean that it means we have an old population which is beginning to retire, and if they retire, the skills are lost, and a lot of the farms are sold off and used for other purposes. So this means that in Wales, our food security is at risk because of the age profile of the people who are involved in the industry. Slide number 16, please. So we did a survey of the types of communication technology that the growers used. And you can see here that 90% of the growers had a laptop or a PC with a broadband connection. But that does mean that 10% of the growers have no information via broadband. So a good coverage, but not complete coverage. 70% have access to the internet via smartphone, and lower numbers have a tablet. Now we can also see that about 65% of the growers have a website, so can advertise through that. A lower number, 48%, have a Facebook page. Only 26% use Twitter, so not a very effective communication mechanism, and 7% use other social media. So a fairly good broadband connection, and a lot can receive information, but not a lot are using social media at the moment to receive information. Slide number 17, please. Now this is a picture of the broadband and coverage and the speeds in Wales. So you can see that most of Wales is in a standard broadband speed, which is in purple there. You can see a lighter blue area in the middle of Wales, which means it has no broadband connections. So these are the mountain areas in the middle of Wales in which the growers can't receive information. And growers have to come down to the markets, which they probably do once a week, to pick up any messages and so on via broadband. Slide number 18, please. So this is the coverage in 2016 of our 4G telephone coverage. So you can see there the whole of the United Kingdom. You can see that England, which is in the southwest there, has very good coverage. Wales, which is in the west, has very poor coverage, but it does cover those areas in which most of the growers exist. And another country, Scotland, which is the very north, has very poor coverage, just around the major cities of Glasgow and Edinburgh. But there's a lot of work going on in Britain to increase that coverage, and you can see on the right-hand side the expected coverage in 2020 that we hope in a couple of years' time that the whole of the country will be able to receive internet connections through this 4G coverage. Slide number 19, please. Now here we've got a survey of sales outlets. So think back to that cycle of influence and how the producer sells the crops. You can see that in Wales, 36% of the growers sell through their own farm gates or have a farm shop on the farm. So that's the major way of selling to the consumer, by the producer selling it directly. We then have 18% go to wholesalers, so they collect a large number of crops from various producers and then sell those onto the retailer. Only 4% of our Welsh production is through supermarkets, and yet a lot of buying is through supermarkets, so our small-scale producers are not able to enter that market very well. 15% of growers sell through farmers' markets. So these are local markets that set up, and the producer goes to those markets and sells the crops there. 32% sell through local retailers, local shops. 26% of crops go to hotels and restaurants. We have a very large tourist industry in Wales. I hope you'll be able to come one day and see it, because we have a lot of nice coastal regions and a lot of good mountains and mountain walking. 9%, a very small percentage, sell online, and 25% sell through other outlets like food fairs, which the government arranges around the country. And only 4% of the crops go to food processing, for instance, the making of ready meals and so on. Slide number 20, please. So this is an example of a farm shop. This is on a farm, and the retailer sets this up, the producer sets this up, and becomes a retailer themselves, sells their own crops, might process some of those crops themselves, so you can see bottles of apple juice on the left-hand side, but also sells other things that entice people to come into the shop. Next slide, please. So, we're all dealing with the provision of information, particularly through digital means. So I've drawn up a slide here of what I think are the most important things to pass through those digital mechanisms. So these are the crucial farm activities that require information, preferably through digital means, but also education. So we need to be able to inform the grower how to plan the crops and how to make sure that their farms have food security and resilience. We need to inform them of how to access credit and finance. We need to help them with facilities and equipment. In Wales, we have machinery circles where farmers can go and rent equipment which is jointly owned by a large number of farmers. We need to help them in planning those facilities and acquiring those facilities. A lot of information is given on crop husbandry and the control of pests and diseases. So we might have information on weather or on the likely outbreaks of pests and how to control them, and we might even have models of those which we can supply to the farmer. We also need to keep them informed of food safety regulations and give them technical information on items such as post-harvest storage, how they keep the crop after it's been harvested. Product pricing is very important to the retailer, particularly if they're selling it themselves, and to the producer if they're selling it themselves. So they need to know the up-to-date, fair pricing so that they get a good return on their crops and they're not pricing themselves out of the markets. We need to give them access to markets, and this is where the producer organisations might be very useful, because the producer organisations can help set up markets or distribution channels. It's also very useful if we can give information to the farmers on how to develop their products, how they make more use of them, how they make more use of other varieties, or how they might process them into products which give added value. Slide 22, please. So, I'd like to mention precision agriculture. This is becoming very much at the front of agriculture in Wales, particularly as we leave the European Union and we need to become more self-reliant. So a definition of precision agriculture is a management strategy that uses information technologies to bring data from multiple sources to bear on decisions associated with crop production. So that is the ability to provide data to the grower and other players and produce it on time, sequences, and produces so it's geographically important. So precision agriculture is about using robots in the fields, using drones to survey the fields, but it's also about providing information to the growers. Slide 23, please. So, as a part of that precision agriculture, in your organisation, you're very involved in digital technologies. So first click is on-farm production technology. And these are the examples such as crop sensors, so you put these in the fields so that you can see what's going on with the temperature and the rainfall, and you can adjust your irrigation fertilizers in response to that. There's GPS, global positioning systems, which help you to operate drones, which are also called UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, which can be used to survey the crop, but may be also developed to do other things. And there are robots. We've had the first field of barley, which hasn't had a person in the field, which has been planted, weeded, and then harvested, all by robots, which are controlled by GPS and seen through the use of drones. So that's the on-farm production technology, but it's largely unaffordable to small-scale farmers. Small-scale farmers aren't likely to make very much use of this technology. Next click. But we do have access, as we've shown from the case study, to knowledge technology, including communication devices such as smartphones. Next click. And the data that we can provide, and is most important to the grower, by looking at these case studies and the work that e-CoDAF has done already, the most important information is financial data. Sales prices, so what you can sell your crop at, but information on best practice for the farmer. So how do they select a crop? How do they feed that crop? And how do they look after that crop? And that might be provided through online tutorials, which is an important part of this knowledge technology. It's also really important that farmers can network with each other, discuss their problems, discuss their sales channels, and discuss prices. We can also use the knowledge technology for those early warning systems, as I've said, to protect against changes in the weather and the outbreaks of pests and diseases. And we can provide predictive models. So there's a lot of work for you to do on providing predictive models. And we can also show the best places to plant crops through soils maps, which geological survey organisations can produce and can be used by a farmer. Slide 24, please. So, delivering the solutions. This is your work, and I'm very pleased indeed to be involved with your organisation, which is doing so much towards delivering these solutions. But to sum up in what I've said, in order to deliver a solution, you have to have a commitment to developing and maintaining an application. So that's the first click. So in your organisation, you need to commit to it and have the support to developing a new application that supplies information. Next click. We need to use those organisations that can provide information. So government and government agencies, the universities and all the information you provide, but also help those producer organisations so there's two-way information going on there. Next click. Having got those organisations together, we need to connect the farmers. We may need to make sure that we have access to the farmers and the farmers are able to use that information. So we need to have a network of farmers involved. Next click. If we simply provide information, farmers may not be able to use it. So we have to make sure that the farmers are being educated through the schools, through any other courses that the farmers can undertake, through outreach and extension work, but for us particularly through providing online tutorials or newsletters or technical data sheets. But once we've done all that, we need to champion the application through individuals and business clusters. To be successful, we need a champion, often an individual person who will see this through. And finally, we need to provide reliable and up-to-date data. It's no point if the information is out of date, particularly on things like sales prices or best practice. So, thank you very much indeed for listening. Obrigado. And I wish you every success in the work that you are doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Skydmore. We hope the questions, considerations about your lecture. Obrigada, professor, Dr. Skydmore. Agora a gente vai abrir para as questões e considerações acerca da palestra. For the questions and considerations, first UNESP, second FETEC, 30 UFPA, 50 UFPA.
Professor, we have one question. We invite the
Bom dia, professor. Considerando que a população, o senhor falou, o Fernando faz favor de traduzir, está muito alto. Considerando que o senhor, o professor falou que a população é uma população envelhecida, eu queria saber se essas coleções de dados, esses datasets que eles estão coletando, se tem alguma relação diferenciada entre os grupos das cidades. Se tem uma população que prefere ter uma preferência, se a população mais nova tem alguma preferência por essas coleções de dados.
Hi, Professor Skydmore. How are you? I'm Dr. Rodriguez. We talk later on email. And I will translate the question of Jacqueline. Jacqueline is a Colombian student here of the PhD program in UNESP. And she was talking about if the elders of rural areas, if the data sets are split up with data from rural areas and from the cities, if they are different, and if they use that kind of data if they use the groups of data to split and understand well how rural areas are made.
Yes. Thank you very much for that question. We do have a lot of background data for it. Wales is a very rural area anyway, so nearly all the growers are in rural regions. Some have better communications than others. Now, the errors that we make are mainly to do with contracts and trying to get contracts for the growers, because we find that if the supermarkets deal with the growers, they will have a very strict contract, and it may be that they decide to reject the crop, so that the crop isn't bought, and it's then plowed back into the ground, and the grower receives no money for that year. So a lot of the growers have decided to set up their own farm shops because they can't deal with the large supermarkets anymore. So our biggest problem for the growers is to have fair contracts with the supermarkets so they have more outlets for the sales. But the other things that we have to be aware of is the information that's supplied. Now, the growers that are large provide money to organisation, a research organisation, through something called a levy. And then they get provided with information back on the research and up-to-date practices. But the smaller farmers can't afford to pay that organisation, so they don't get the information that they require. So we have to find another mechanism through the universities and through government funding to provide information for the smaller growers. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Now we passaremos a palavra para o polo. One more question, please.
Não, mas dá para fazer.
A gente vai ter mais uma pergunta aqui, Cristiano, rapidinho, tudo bem?
Vocês conseguem escutar?
Conseguimos, podemos fazer só mais uma pergunta, Cristiano?
Tá. Então, sem uma perguntinha.
Não fala para segurar a pergunta que fala.
Já definido que ele tem disposição de participar nesse dispositivo de pesquisa que está aqui para no Prof. E segundo, como se consegue integrar a organização das pequenas comunidades de agricultores em uma situação de abandono como o nosso do Brasil tem hoje. Isso é um caso
Final, a gente fecha.
Yes.
My name is Christian Rio-Zapata. I am responsible for the conservation and information science here. Also, I am trying to link to the campus of the University of Pará. This is specialized in education applied to several. I think one of those agriculture in small crops. We are in the Amazon basin in the north overseas, an area which is bigger than India. And the other side is one of the least developed areas in Brazil out of the world. And the other is the one of the world, which is like in the far, far west. So I got two questions to come. The first one is, if you would be willing to contact us and to try to replicate your own research here in the north of Brazil, in the Amazon basin, as I thought it was very impressive how systematic you were in the analysis of the situation of the farmers. That would be the first question. The second one is, how can we manage the possibility of reinforcing small farmers with all these results? In a state of example, as here in the North Brazil, how could it be? You show me how much power of what is the main with the amount of electricity. So, what do you think about how come we deal with that abandonment? And
Thank you very much for your questions. It's a great pleasure to meet you and speak to you. In answer to the first question, I'm very pleased to work with you in looking at the issues in your area. It's a delight to do that, and I wish you luck with the work that you have. I think in relation to replicating the work that I've done, I think there's a lot more that we could do to develop it, to make it a lot more appropriate to your regions. So I think that rather than replicate the work, it would be very good to try and develop it further and develop surveys which are more appropriate to your areas. But if you give me the opportunity, I'd be very pleased to work with you on that. In relation to the second question, yes, abandoning people who don't have access to this smart technology, which I'm not sure the line wasn't very good, but was that the question that you were asking? So I think with people who don't have access to the technology, it is a very difficult problem indeed. And I think that it means that we have to have a twofold approach. The first is, as e-CoDAF is doing, looking at the digital mechanisms, and I think these can work very well, particularly in rural areas. It's interesting to look at Africa and see the coverage in Africa of mobile phone technology, not necessarily broadband, but communication between farmers. So in an area, continent where you'd expect coverage and bandwidth to be very pronounced, in fact, the use of the digital technologies has proved very useful indeed. In fact, it is producing a lot of very good developments. But what do we do about the farmers who are going to be separated more and more because of their lack of access to these digital technologies? And I think that there has to continue to be a role for the traditional extension workers, those outreach workers who go into communities. So I think it's very important that we don't put all our emphasis on digital communications, that we make sure that it's understood that there have to be other routes for these other farmers so they're not abandoned. We do have the problems in Wales that England has very good coverage and assumes that the rest of the country is the same, so uses social media. But when I talk to farmers, they say, we don't know what's going on unless we come to the market, which we might not do very often. Only when we come to the market, when we use our phones, or get access to this information. So you need to be able to provide us with information another way. So I think that the back of farmers is really important, and I'm very pleased that you brought that up. So we need to develop the digital technologies, we need to improve coverage, we need to improve the education, and have government policy to do that, but make sure that we have traditional extension workers there to go out to those farms and make sure they're not abandoned. Thank you. Ricardo.
Mi profesor acabó de saber que primero estaría encantado de poder venir y colaborar con especialistas para no desarrollar un ensayo con circunstancias distintas entre el País de Gales y Brasil, Brasil. Queria que esse tema ajuste importante aqui, esse seria próprio nossa bom. Em tudo a respeito de como lidar com esse estado de abandono, poder desenvolver uma agricultura familiar saudável. Eles estão falando que, efetivamente, as tecnologias digitais estão iniciando uma revolução, estão ajudando muito com isso na tecnologia inteligente, mas é indubitável que existe uma institucionalidade em que muitos grupos de cultivadores, de agricultores estão ficando isolados. Dá exemplo da diferença entre Inglaterra e País de Gales. Inglaterra muito bem qualificado, Gales pouco qualificado. Os agricultores só conseguem se enterar com tudo que está acontecendo, o preço do mercado, etc., quando vão a visitar o pomar e lá conseguem semear y por siguiente ya lo que está aconteciendo. Então, é importante que todos consideramos que muitas pessoas que estejam afastadas da tecnologia, mas tampouco cair na própria definição que a tecnologia tem que ser determinada. Então, é super perfeito. Many times processes are actually forward to that lesson.
Obrigado, Christian. Nós temos mais uma pergunta aqui em Tupã, antes de a gente passar para Prudente, para Tucuruí. Por favor, professora. Professor, we have one more question from you.
Hello, thank you for your lecture. It was very important and interesting for us. My name is Ana Lorenzani. I'm a professor here in the graduate program of Agribusiness and Development. And I have a question. The case you presented show a very diverse distribution channels. So basically they are short chains, short supply chains. And in order to attend the requirements, I understand the smallholder farmers in Brazil, what we call family farmers, they need to have a set of resources and abilities. And here in Brazil, we have a very diverse and very heterogeneous agriculture, family farming agriculture. And so, in your opinion, I'd like to have your opinion on how to overcome this challenge to introduce technology, precision technology, information technology. I'd like you to talk about the role of the government as well as the role of the private sector. I think it would be important for us. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very interesting question. You're completely right that what we have in Wales are these short supply chains with direct sales in most cases from the producer to the consumer. Now, we have the small rural communities with local retailers within them. We don't have many supermarkets except in the large cities. Now, we have a lot of problems with rural depopulation. So, if the local retailer is lost and the local growers are lost, then the community tends to collapse. So we've had a lot of circumstances where a small shop has disappeared, people can no longer buy the foods within the village and have to move towards the larger cities because of this. And the communities become smaller and smaller. So the government is very keen on trying to support those local retailers and support short supply chains. So it has put a lot of investment into short supply chains and only short supply chains. So they're currently, most of the funding within Wales for horticulture is to try and promote short supply chains. So the government has recognised the importance of that rather than these long supply chains with multiple retailers. So I think that's very beneficial that the government has realised that. So it's set up a number of projects, of which Horticulture Wales was one of those, looking at various aspects of educating the farmers and going out to them. So these projects set up firstly where they produce a database of the farmers, so we know who they are and how they can be contacted. Now there are a lot of grants in Europe for the farmers, so the farmers apply for these grants and that's how we know where they are. So once we know where they are, we know how to communicate with them, and we start by doing surveys of what their needs are, whether it's financial needs, or whether it's crop information, or whether they need further education or not. So we do it in stages, then we analyse those data, and the government does its own large surveys across the UK, and then we can channel support, financial support, into whatever areas the farmers need, whatever are the highest priorities. So as I say, the short supply chains have been recognised as being extremely important and crucial to the maintaining of the rural communities. But we need to understand what those communities need, and then put money in. But it's also important, and very important for e-CoDAF, to commit to developing those applications. So the crucial part of the success of any of those developments is to find a champion, somebody within the rural community who will push for a development and communicate with his friends and neighbours or her friends and neighbours to make sure that the developments happen. So we do this as a staged approach, firstly recognising the importance of the short supply chain, secondly finding their needs, thirdly finding a champion, and fourthly committing to developing digital applications or the non-digital applications where they're needed. I hope that comes a little way to answer your question, but offline we can always discuss that more.
Thank you, Dr. Skydmore. And the further question is considerations to Korea.
Good morning, Dr. David. My name is Jackson, and I will ask you about the Jackson's question. And we have two questions to Korea. The first one is, what are the difficulties involving the use of drones and robots?
Yes, the work on robots is happening because of the changes in the country that we are withdrawing from the European Union, and a lot of the people who work on farms come from Europe, and that might no longer be available, so that we won't have enough labour for the farms. So the government has put a lot of money into developing the robots that produce the crops. A lot of them are just to do weeding, and those are more environmentally friendly because we don't need to use pesticides, herbicides. But it's at a very early stage. And the risk is also that they rely on technologies working, so we don't want them to go wrong in the field and set off across other fields. And they also rely on the GPS being working. So I think we're at a very early stage with the robots. It's very interesting for universities to be involved with those. And our government has put tens of millions of pounds of currency into the development of robots. So keep your eye on that space and see what will develop.
Thank you, Professor David. And the second one is for Professor Vivian's question.
Hello, Professor David. It's really interesting to see your lecture and hear all your experience in the UK. For us, it's an advanced stage, and we are looking forward to become something like that. In that, so I would like to ask you about something that we are quite similar, is that about the involvement of young people in the media agriculture. So here in Tucuruí, we also have the difficulty in involving young people in this area. So how you try to overcome this problem, this barrier for evolving the familiar agriculture in the UK? Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. You're quite right, it is a very big problem, and I don't think that we're solving it at the moment. As you can see from that, only 1% of people under 20. The difficulties are not only in Wales, but they're in England and in Ireland, across the sea from us, where communities are being depopulated. The young people are not as interested in working on the land because it's not as exciting as working in the city. They're becoming educated in other things which we can go and work in the cities to do. So it means that our food systems are being put at risk. The ways that we do try and encourage people back onto the farms is by giving grants. So the government gives grants for young farmers to either buy farms or to buy equipment so it becomes easier for them to stay on the farms. It also is called New Entrant Scheme, so that people who live in cities and rural areas but aren't involved in farms, and yet they're interested in farming, can move into farming. If they don't have these grants, they can't buy or rent a farm and can never go into it. So through this grant system, we're able to bring other people into farming. And that's been a very successful scheme to bring new people into farming that weren't traditionally in it. The other way is to make the farmers feel more connected, that they don't feel as lonely. Loneliness amongst farmers and isolation has proved to be a very big problem indeed, causing mental health issues and other things. So the digital technologies, providing networks between farmers so they can communicate their problems, and the more information is very useful to reducing that isolation. But also it's more exciting for the young people. They're able to use their knowledge of computer gaming and so on, and the whole of family farming becomes a lot more interesting. So we work on trying to make farmers feel less isolated, bringing new people into farming who are enthusiastic about it, but also trying to make farming more up to date, more interesting for the young people to be involved. But I think your question is extremely important, because unless we can get this right, we're going to suffer from food security problems and the loss of skills, because the older people have the knowledge and it won't be passed down unless we can have the young people there to receive it. So thank you for your question.